My name is Dan Starta, and I'm the chairman of Kearney Greater China. Today we have a presentation to discuss with you. When winter comes, prepare for spring. We take a look at the post-COVID-19 world and its impact, specifically with respect to the consumer marketplace and supply chain strategies. We'll first start on the consumer side. And what we'll do is take a look at where the world was headed pre-COVID and what are some of the trends afterward. What are the changes and how do we expect them to impact the consumer marketplaces? What will stay? What will change? Well, after that, we will take a look at supply chain strategies and some of the fundamental shifts that are going on. Let's start with the consumer side. Before COVID-19, we've gotten used to a few key things. Three things in particular. One, we were trading online. Two, we were trading globally. And three, we were individual-centric in our consumption. So what do those mean? Trading online. We had saw overall growth of consumption, specifically in China and the US, that were record paces, growing well and continuing to look like they were going to have a good trajectory. We were seeing e-commerce. China and South Korea both had penetration rates. 28% of retail sales were through e-commerce. Now that was bigger than the US, which was at around 15%. And it was also larger than the world average, which was 13%. So there was kind of two stages. Stage two, where Asia was at for the most part, and then the rest of the world, which was really kind of in a stage one of purchasing. So the online world penetration was going well and continuing to grow. Trading globally. Since the 1980s, we'd seen a ramp up in global trade. In 1985, global trade was around 38% of global GDP. In 2008, it reached 61% of global GDP. It's plateaued a bit since then, moved a little bit up and down, but generally stayed right around that same number for global trade. The other thing we've seen is individual centricity. So as we look at the consumer, and they're a little bit more individual centric. So they focused on things like affluence, seduction, how do you treat me well, scale. Additionally, there were some other factors they looked for in their suppliers, the people that they bought products from. They looked for trust, they looked for authenticity, they looked for efficiency, social conscience, responsibility, and self-expression. Those are some of the factors as we think about the consumer trends that we use as our baseline for thinking about how the world has changed. Part of thinking about how that world has changed is looking at what shape the recovery will take. If we look at SARS in 2003, it was a bit of a limited impact when we had a V shape. Recovered fairly quickly, limited impact, limited changes to the rest of the world around it. In the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we saw more of a U or W-shaped recovery that took a longer period of time and had some fundamental changes. There was higher unemployment. There were fundamental changes into the way people spent money and viewed the world. In the 1930s, we had an L-shaped recovery, a recession, which fundamentally changed the world for years to come. Out of this, we're still not sure of what shape the recovery will take. What we do know is we've already seen some effects that may last with us for the future. And we'll talk about those in a minute. Before that, what we want to do is touch on how the world will shape itself. What are the things that provide us with a view of the future of the world? And if we go to page 4, there's really two key dimensions that we're looking at. One is the level of international cooperation, and secondly is social cohesion, trust. Do we look for the world in the same way? So when we think about social cohesion, there's either social cohesion or social erosion. Are we working better together and have the same type of view, or are we moving further apart? As we look at those, social cohesion is the more dominant factor. If social cohesion is working and we cooperate well, we have what we call the movable feast. Everything is working together. We're cooperating, we're building, we're moving in a harmonious way towards the future. If social cohesion is good, if we still have that trust and we're trying to work for the better future, even if we're not cooperating, we still have the sun also rises scenario. Things still go fairly well. However, if that social cohesion drops and we move into social erosion, where things aren't working cooperatively together for a better future, then we run into two of our more dangerous scenarios. If we have social erosion and we still cooperate, we have and have-nots. What we have is people who cooperate, but they don't trust each other. They aren't moving for the same things. So we will have givers and takers. We will have winners and losers. We will have haves and have-nots. We will have a world that works together, but they don't necessarily trust or work in the same way towards the same values. And lastly, which is for whom the bell tolls, which is when we don't cooperate and we have social erosion, so we're working in our own worlds. And the growth that we've seen from a global economy and trade and cooperativeness and working together really starts to fragment and limit the ability for the economies to build an engine that provides growth for the future. Part of this gets shaped by the level of the type of return to normality we see. If we see a V shape, it's a little easier. If we see an L shape, it becomes much more difficult. But what we've already started to see is some of the shifts in this. We've seen lower levels of cooperation. We've seen some of the breakdowns in trust as well too. We're not quite sure. We're kind of hopeful that it will land more on the social cohesion side, which gives us positive outcomes. But we're still waiting to see how the world will shape itself out. But I think it's going to be one of the key indicators as you start to look at things to watch for in the future. Let's take the next step down. Now that we've got past the global concepts, we're going to look a little bit next level down at the consumer. So there's 4 things that we look at, what the 4 long-term impacts on the consumer, and this is on page 5. And there's also 2 new trends that we've seen. So the 4 long-term impacts are e-commerce and some of the shifts there. Purpose-driven consumption, health and wellness 2.0, and more differentiated consumers. So e-commerce, we've already said e-commerce is doing well, but the interesting part is from March to April in the US, UK, and Australia. US, we saw 19% growth in 1 month in e-commerce. In the UK, it was 26%. In Australia, 15%. 1 month change. We already know China and South Korea were advanced, but they even had growth as well too. Not just did they have growth, but they brought in new types of consumers that hadn't necessarily thought of e-commerce or brought new products through e-commerce during that time frame, which will fundamentally change and may stick with us for the longer term. On the supplier side, the people who are selling us the products also thought differently. So for instance, we saw Perfect Diary, who sells makeup, have their makeup artists essentially turn into anchors where working with their viewers, helping them, show them techniques, and they increased their viewership by a factor of 3 to 10. So the way they interacted with their consumers through e-commerce evolved as well too. So we see not only consumers evolving in how they use e-commerce, but in this kind of enhanced petri dish that we call COVID-19, we saw both the suppliers and the consumers evolving their capabilities much more quickly. Second item, purpose-driven consumption. People made different choices in who they buy from. They looked for who's benefiting society, who is focused on safety, who cares about me as a customer. Now that varies by country where the spikes were, but we saw deliberate choices being made at the consumer level. Another point, health and wellness 2.0. People have made health and wellness not negotiable. 79% say they've made choices, either somewhat or strongly agree that they've made choices based on health and wellness. They're looking for healthier products to consume. They're looking for a hygienic product. They're looking for sanitization capabilities. So they're looking for a variety of things. But health and wellness 2.0, it's a trend that we think will continue well beyond COVID as people think about the world that we live in and how interactive it is. And then lastly, more differentiated consumers. As we've gone more online, as we've bought more things, we find there are easier to go our own way, that products that are tailored to me, services that are tailored to me, new sources, places I hadn't considered before, where maybe I went and bought in a physical market, now I went online and I found a new place that maybe is pretty easy to buy from. I maybe found new products that may suit me better. There are choices that consumers have made in this environment that may stick, that will be different. And we need to think about how those interact. So e-commerce has grown and learned. We've seen more purpose-driven consumption, a more greater focus on health, and consumers are becoming more differentiated in the way they see, and providers need to become more differentiated in the way they see consumers. Next, we're going to say there's 2 new trends. 2 trends. One, in-home becomes the new home, and value focus. So in home, we've all worked from home now. Businesses have learned that you can work from home. They become more innovative in how they've worked from home. More conference calls, more teaming sessions, new techniques. The environment has evolved as well. We have more communal events and chats with our friends. We watch concerts online. We see different types of entertainments. We have more live streaming. We go shopping on a live stream. We've boosted new areas that will fundamentally change as well too. We buy more cleaning products and we think about cleaning. We think about the casual world of our home differently, and we think about home entertainment. We found new ways. So because of this forced view of staying home, we've also found new ways to exploit the home environment, which will change. It adds a new trend to how people think about what products they sell as we move from in-home is now a new way to be home. And then secondly, in the new trend is value focus. As I mentioned before, consumers were focused on increasing their luxury component or their level of influence, feeling good about themselves. They still want to feel good, but now they do it with more of a value focus. So, when you have something that comes about like a crisis, a COVID-19, it tends to allow you to focus on what are your fears. You worry about money. You worry about your health. We economize on those. When we asked people where their biggest fears were, finance and health, 75% said they're concerned or very concerned about those. So what do? How does that change the situation? We look at brands we trust. We focus on the brands we trust. We also look at not so much the luxury goods, but the mass luxury, the good enough, the thing that makes me feel good, makes me feel special, but also preserves my money. In the US, one of the things that was interesting was we saw people make choices where they would buy brand names in groceries before, now move to some of the private label brands, some of the more local brands. We saw up to a 5 to 10% movement in some of those. So significant changes when people were looking at how do I economize, how do I help myself, both from a monetary perspective and a health perspective. So as we take a step back, in the post-COVID-19 world, we expect consumers to change. E-commerce, proliferation, new ways of doing business, new markets to tap in. Seniors using e-commerce like they never had before. We see purpose-driven brands and trust being a fundamental driving factor in the way consumers view who they deal with on e-commerce. They've had to deal with them and count on them like they've never had before. We see a greater connection, more customer centricity. E-commerce is becoming smarter, artificial intelligence, analytics, learning about the consumer, becoming very important, and also adapting to how consumers work to give them better information and serve them better. And then lastly, more at home. It's a trend that's here to stay. We see some fundamental changes, whether it's shifts in businesses, working from home more, people shifting entertainment media to home, new things that they've learned about themselves, but a new home market that we see as also here to stay. So those are some of the things going on the consumer side. We also see a shift on the supply chain side. So we're going to talk about that next. Where's the supply chain headed? So if you look at China, China's been one of the world's leaders. There's no doubt about that. Over the last 10 years, China has become one of the manufacturers, if not the manufacturing hub of the world for quite a bit of items. Whether you look at machinery, electrical equipment, plastics, automotive, medical supplies, China's become a leader. 70% of the PPE masks are produced in China. If you look at the active pharma ingredients, those doubled being manufactured in China from 2010 to 2019, and 80% of the world's active pharma ingredients are made in either India or China. So there is a concentration of manufacturing. That is starting to change, but it's not just because of COVID-19. There were already changes going on over the past few years. If you look at the changes that were occurring, there are reasons. We did a survey back in 2017, 2018 to look at some of those changes. And on page 7, we have some of the results of that survey. That does not mean China will diminish. We still expect continued growth in China. The trajectory may change, but what we think is this is a wake-up call as well too for Chinese companies to make sure that they're addressing some of these fundamental changes, whether it's labor costs, increasing labor costs, challenges that other companies are facing, but help them address some of these challenges. So we had Things like international logistics costs, which was our top one. Proximity to customers and markets. How do I get my design team there? How do I get products back? That proximity makes a difference. Total cost of ownership, risk mitigation, quality issues, latency in the supply chain, time to market, IP concerns. Some of these have been addressed. But we're also seeing a new shift now with COVID-19 that's putting additional pressures on this. One of the interesting things was at the bottom we see state, local government incentives. Those were actually one of the things that probably made the least amount of difference. It really is fundamental business choices that are driving people. So there is the opportunity for businesses to understand what those fundamental choices are, have discussions with, as a small, medium enterprise or a larger scale business, have those discussions with your customers, understand where their pain points are so that you can address them now, so that reshoring doesn't become an option, moving out, and you become their supplier for a longer period of time. But it's really important to take a step back and understand where the reasons are that companies are looking to either move their supply chain. As we hit COVID-19, there's been increased pressures, and we'll talk about those in a bit. But, when we think about resiliency of the supply chain, there's 5 trends that allow you to stay resilient. Diversification of your global supply chain. And this is some of the things we've seen, some of the pain points we've seen come out in COVID-19 as well. Rapid responsiveness towards uncertainty. The increasing importance on planning and forecasting, global resource allocation and integration in logistics, and supply chain finance. And I'll drill down a bit in each of those. We're on page 8 now. But the diversification of the global supply network. Only 11% of auto companies, auto manufacturers, have alternative suppliers in an emergency. So when we have issues where we have lockdowns in countries or a COVID-19 stay-at-home issue, how do we get our supply? Are we diversified enough? Businesses need to think about that more. And they're thinking about, how do I diversify that? Not just from a virus that goes out, but what happens if there's a fire in a plant? What if there's a plant outage? How do I shift my supply? What's my adaptability and my flexibility in managing my supply chain? So not just diversification, but also the adaptiveness of being able to shift supply, supplier to ramp up. We've heard a lot in the past few years about cost effectiveness, cost efficiencies, lean. Those have driven very, very tight, cost-effective supply chains. But they've also left us very tightly bound so that when challenges do occur, it's often difficult to maintain flexibility. So we need to start thinking about those as well. Rapid responses to uncertainty. How fast can you adapt to uncertainty? One of the ways, if you look at Yongwei, upstream collaboration, or Walmart with cross borders, HEMA, outsourcing. Various ways that you can look at how do you respond to uncertainty by being flexibility in multiple approaches within your supply chain to be able to adapt. The increasing importance on planning and forecasting. As we look at where we've come, things have gotten very conservative on inventories, supplier communication, cost focus. But one of the biggest ones is also looking at the consumer and the market, because we are seeing fundamental shifts. So while we're also looking at how do we get this tight supply chain and how do we build agility and adaptability, the next complex piece of this comes in is that my consumer that I had might start to change and evolve. They certainly will, but there's trigger points that cause that to happen. COVID might be one of those trigger points for your products. And part of this is understanding how your supply chain planning and forecasting builds in that consumer component, the market component, to understand where those factors are changing in your business. Global resource allocation and integration logistics, that we are seeing strong shifts in air, ground, and sea. And it's not just that they're shifting, we're seeing capacity constraints, which may affect the timeliness of goods, which may affect the timeliness of inbound supply to manufacture products. As those things shift and change, the supply chain flexibility and adaptability also becomes an issue. So we need to look at the full end-to-end aspects of our supply chain. Then we're going to look at supply chain and finance. In a crisis, cash is king. It's also a great learning experience. When things go well, we tend to get a little loose with the cash. We tend to get a little loose with terms. There are whether it's returns, canceled orders, delayed payments, all those affect the ability to finance the running operations of an organization. Where do I get my money from? Well, hopefully I get it from my continuing cash. Worst case, I may have to go to a bank, or may seek outside funding. But really, one of the aspects of this is, how do I run a better supply chain, and what can I do? We have a framework that we look at as Kearney that helps us take a view of end-to-end supply chains to say, where can you drive out cash? How do you improve the flow of cash through my supply chain, whether it's lowering my supply points, accelerating payments, reducing my outbound payments that I have to make, and looking at how I collect money. So it's really focusing on an end-to-end view that helps to improve cash flow in an organization. So when we look at resiliency, we really look at, how do I diversify? How do I respond? Do I have the right level of planning and forecasting that brings in the consumer and the market into my aspects of my planning, as well as potential scenarios and crises? How do I look at my global resource allocation and my logistics? And then, as importantly, how do I finance this? And am I operating in an efficient way as I can? One of the interesting parts is we're in an online environment for this. It's nice in that we can show up and go through this without having to all physically be present. We also miss the interaction and the communication. But like other things that we found in life, we're finding new ways to do things. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we look at an online affair, an online interaction, and how that's changed. In the past, you'd sign up for a trade show. Still sign up, but it's an online trade show. I would look at the printed brochure, figure out where I'd go. Here, I have a bigger choice. I can join the live streams. I can jump in and jump out. I can focus on the ones that are most meaningful to me. So I have to be more impactful in talking to the people that I want to make an impact on. I can have live product demos. Can't see those, but I can have a live stream that really gives me a hands-on focus on how something might work. I just have to think about it a little bit differently. Here I might have a request for quote in the offline world. I can browse or compare quotes just as easily in an online world, if not more so. When it comes to products, I can use virtual reality to visualize products. I can turn them around. I can turn them upside down. I can go in to see what the production line looks like. There's a variety of things. I can look at quality specs. But the level of integration that now comes, just sitting from my desk, has also, in this world, now forces me to think about how I portray those to my customers in a new way. One-on-one consultation services, very easy to do. And we become a lot more comfortable and familiar with using video conferencing now to have those conversations. And then lastly, you can contact the salesperson, you can take orders, but you can just as easily do with an online transaction. So what we've seen is, as the e-commerce world has evolved, so has events like this. We've now moved from a offline presence, a physical world, to an online one that has a lot of the same levels of richness, and maybe in some cases even more levels of richness, and certainly effective use of time in moving things and being able to focus on the needs that are most important to you. And lastly, as we think about SMEs in particular, there is a need to adapt to the new normal. There is a new normal. Some of the overarching trends we're seeing: global pressure, greater pressure on global sourcing, cross-border pressures. We're seeing some of the fractures at a global level. Needs for increased visibility and transparency in supply chains. Where's my supply at? If are you going to take on new people and I put my product at risk? And financial pressures. Those are all realities that have come even more so to the forefront with COVID-19. But from a small medium enterprise, on page 7, we're talking about 3 specific ones that, as we think about a new normal, that are really critical for businesses. Number 1, identify your vulnerabilities, understand what they are. Number 2, explore new business opportunities. And 2, adapt new business models. So again, we'll drive down a little bit into each one. With vulnerabilities, Where do your vulnerabilities exist? Where do they exist in your supply chain? Where do they exist in your customer knowledge? There's new tools and advanced tools that you can use, whether it's in data management, intelligent automation, analytics capability, artificial intelligence. We as a firm, when we Kearney come in and we talk to our clients, we look at those, we bring those together, and we try to take it and twist it into new insights that help a person, help a business understand where they may be vulnerable, where competitors see the world differently, especially as you start to think about who's the competitors out there that you haven't even thought of, how will they see your business, and what types of vulnerabilities exist. What flexibility should you have with sourcing? How do you make sure that you're protected, that your business is protected? And how do you think about supply risk management? So those are the types of vulnerabilities that are important to understand as a business. With COVID-19, one of the new normals is you can explore new businesses. There have been shifts. Understanding, taking that same analytical approach or looking at your business, taking a gut feel even sometimes as to where the target categories are that have a growing demand. What has changed? What has changed in your business? What has changed in your competitors? How are they addressing customers differently? Taking a look backwards. How do I change my production? How do I modularize it? How do I shift? How do I adapt my lines to demand changes? How do I rethink, refocus? We're all addressing safety issues in manufacturing today, social distancing, a variety of other things. But one of the other pieces is how do you rethink your business when you look at the changing environment? And lastly, how do I adapt my new business model? This could mean flexibility from a workforce, lowering my costs. There's a lot of things. As we've gone through our own business changes in operating and ramping up in this world, we're looking at how do we adapt potentially to new business models. So whether it's remote working across industries, e-commerce changes, how should our business adapt and change to either get closer to our customers, to drive efficiencies that allow us, to allow workers greater flexibility? What are some of the things we need to do to make changes? As we think about this COVID-19 world, it's been a shock to each of us, to the world, to the way we operate, to the way we think about to the future. But where there are shocks, there are also opportunities as well. There are shifts that have occurred that are out there. There are threats that are out there to our businesses. We need to understand what those threats are and adapt and work towards improving our case against them. We need to take the opportunities in the market where fundamental consumer shifts have happened and take advantage of those. This is, there's a saying that says, never waste a crisis. A crisis, these are bad times. There are things that occur that we don't like. But there are also, out of these, we always see the growth. We see the future, and we wait for the future. In parts of the world, in China, we're already moving towards that with a reinvigoration of the economy. And soon, hopefully, the rest of the world continues to grow, move back onto the pace of that. But with that, we see these fundamental changes of COVID-19 that will stick and will stay with us. Whether it's the changing consumer, whether it's some of the supply chain strategies, there's some fundamental changes that will stay with us in this, that will allow us to both thrive and adapt our businesses for the future. Again, my name is Dan Starta. I'm with Kearney Greater China. I'd like to thank you again. We've just scratched the surface of this topic. There's quite a bit more. If you want more information, please go to kearney.com. You can get additional information or insights and more detail on this report. But I'd like to thank you again for listening to our presentation, When Winter Comes, Prepare for Spring. It's been a great discussion on post-COVID-19, looking at where we're headed from a consumer standpoint and from supply chains. Thanks again.